Welcome, comrades and friends. Welcome, workers. Welcome, allies. Welcome back to Working Class Revolt. I'm your host, Dust James, the Marxist-Leninist truck driver. I'm coming to you live from my humble home in rural North Carolina. And we're always glad to have with us our great, honorable, powerful co-host down in the land down under, David Fox. How are things tonight?
Yeah, good morning. From here, from Australia, it's morning to us. We're in our Sunday morning here. No, I'm going very well. It's a lovely spring morning outside now. We're out of the last phases of winter, and yeah, looking very nice out
All
there
right,
at the
and we're
moment.
very honored to have with us for this study meeting the socially radical guitarist, Christian Singrio out of Canada. Greetings, brother. How are things in Canada this evening?
Oh, they're doing very good, very good. I'm in Toronto now after having a picnic with other party members, other Communist Party members, and I was just spending a dinner with Ed and Jonah from the Canada Files. So things are doing very good, very busy, very bustling out here in this multicultural mini space in Kensington, Toronto.
Right on. Good to hear from you. So, this we try to do alternating, work and study meetings, and we just finished studying. Um, we finished everything except the main essay, and we are city builders. And now we're going to read the J.V. Stalin, The Foundations of Leninism. And this is my favorite Marxist material. This book changed my life. I went from not really comprehending what scientific socialism was to having a broad global picture of what's going on, the meaning and the understanding of imperialism, which was Lenin's contribution, which Stalin expanded upon and put in clear words for the revolutionary working class masses to understand. And it's been a long time coming. I'm finally glad to study this on Working Class Revolt. This evening, we're simply going to read the introduction, read and discuss the introduction. It's only about 2.5 pages, so we're not going to get real in depth. Hopefully, we'll have an interesting conversation. Maybe if we want to go around and talk a little bit about the background or what this piece means personally to them. David Fox, if you want to start.
Here's the 1945 print. It was printed by Progress Publishers in Moscow in 1945, and obviously there were just discussions before this. So hopefully everything, the content's still pretty much the same because things do change. And obviously you have the picture of the great man himself and going on through this. One thing about his works, I think how Stalin wrote things, it was actually very easy for a lot of common people to understand. Really, I think in a lot of ways, especially on his works of historical and dialectical materialism, but also I've read the Foundations of Leninism before, and he really, instead of getting right technical about it, he actually puts it in very simple ways. You look at how he writes, and as I said, you can pick the book up, and you can actually, it's a lot easier to understand than say I've read some other classics out there. The other thing as well, I think one thing he had an influence in writing style on was Comrade Chairman Mao. He certainly, if you have a look at both their writing styles, it's very similar. You thought, oh, I opened up one of the Chairman Mao's works one time, and I read, I thought, oh, Stalin wrote that, but no, they were very, very similar, and obviously played a huge influence on how a lot of future Marxists in their writing and how they articulate their words, etc. So, I mean, this was actually quite a good introductory into Marxism, Leninism, scientific socialism.
Christian, any background? Any interesting background or personal relationship to the piece?
So the Foundations of Leninism, yeah, that's basically what every Marxist will say when they read Stalin's work. It's simplified understanding of dialectical materialism and a simplified understanding of Lenin's philosophy. So this book, particularly, it helped me to understand things in plain language, and I think everybody will be able to appreciate that during this reading.
All right, so without further ado, we're going to just read the big man himself. So we're going to start off and read it paragraph by paragraph. Shouldn't take that line. Hopefully, we don't get lost with the different translations. The foundations of Leninism is a big subject. To exhaust it, a whole volume would be required. Indeed, a whole number of volumes would be required. Naturally, therefore, my lectures cannot be an exhaustive exposition of Leninism. At best, they can offer a concise synthesis of the foundations of Leninism. Nevertheless, I consider it useful to give this synopsis in order to lay down some basic points of departure necessary for the successful study of Leninism. David?
Expounding the foundations of Leninism does not yet mean expounding the basis of Lenin's world outlook. Lenin's world outlook and the foundations of Leninism are not conterminous. Lenin was a Marxist, and Marxism is, of course, the basis of the world outlook. But from this, it does not at all follow that an exposition of Leninism ought to begin with an exposition of the foundations of Marxism. To expound Leninism means to expound the distinctive and new in the works of Lenin that Lenin contributed to the general treasury of Marxism, and that is naturally connected with his name. Only in this sense will I speak in my lectures of the foundations of Leninism. Oh, sorry. Over to you, Christian.
And so, what is Leninism? Some say that Leninism is the application of Marxism to the conditions that are peculiar to the situation in Russia. This definition contains a particle of truth, but not the whole truth by any means. Lenin, indeed, applied Marxism to Russian conditions and applied it in a masterly way. But if Leninism were only the application of Marxism to the conditions that are peculiar to Russia, it would be a purely national and only a national, a purely Russian and only a Russian phenomenon. We know, however, that Leninism is not merely a Russian, but an international phenomenon rooted in the whole of international development. That is why I think this definition suffers from one-sidedness. And yeah, go ahead, Dustin.
Others say that Leninism is the revival of the revolutionary elements of Marxism of the 40s of the 19th century, as distinct from the Marxism of subsequent years, when it is alleged it became moderate, non-revolutionary. If we disregard this foolish and vulgar division of the teachings of Marx into two parts, revolutionary and moderate, we must admit that even this totally inadequate and unsatisfactory definition contains a particle of truth. This particle of truth is that Lenin did indeed restore the revolutionary content of Marxism, which had been suppressed by the opportunists of the Second International. Still, that is but a particle of truth. The whole truth about Leninism is that Leninism is not only restored Marxism, but also took a step forward, developing Marxism further under the new conditions of capitalism and of the class struggle of the whole proletariat. David?
What then, in the last analysis, is Leninism? Leninism is Marxism of the era of imperialism and of the proletarian revolution. To be more exact, Leninism is the theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution in general, the theory and tactics of the dictatorship of the proletariat in particular. Marx and Engels pursued their activities in the pre-revolutionary period. We have the proletarian revolution in mind. when developed imperialism did not exist. In the period of the proletarians' preparation for revolution, in the period when the proletarian revolution was not yet an immediate practical inevitability. Lenin, however, the disciple of Marx and Engels, pursued his activities in the period of developed imperialism, in the period of the unfolding proletarian revolution, when the proletarian revolution had already triumphed in one country, had smashed bourgeois democracy, and had ushered in the era of proletarian democracy, the era of the Soviets. Christian.
Yes. That is why Leninism is the further development of Marxism. It is usual to point to the exceptionally militant and exceptionally revolutionary character of Leninism. This is quite correct. But this specific feature of Leninism is due to two causes. Firstly, to the fact that Leninism emerged from the proletarian revolution, the imprint of which it cannot but bear. Secondly, to the fact that it grew and became strong in clashes with the opportunism of the Second International, the fight against which was and remains an essential preliminary condition for a successful fight against capitalism. It must not be forgotten that between Marx and Engels on the one hand and Lenin on the other, there lies a whole period of undivided domination of the opportunism of the Second International, and the ruthless struggle against this opportunism could not but constitute one of the most important tasks of Leninism.
Powerful, brief statement and introduction by the great man Stalin himself. I think we'll start out by doing an initial response. I've read this many times, and I like how it's written like he's speaking. He's written like it's having a conversation with you. I think one of the things that stuck out to me currently, because of the very divisive nature of the internet and the way our society has become highly polarized, he doesn't start, cussing out the opportunists. He gives them harsh words, but he's not sitting there cussing them out and calling them, names and trying to cancel them. He's saying like they were a material danger. They dominated the revolutionary thing. And he also comes up with these definitions. He puts out these wrong definitions, but he's like, this definition's wrong, but it has this kernel of truth in there. And the whole idea of being able to read something, get something true of it, and then read something else, get something true, and come up with another conclusion, are signs of a more advanced theoretical theoretician than a lot of the folks that are out there. I ask people, go back and return to source, look at the great revolutionaries, what they did, what they're saying, the depth, and how they're saying it. I think it's really powerful. And a lot of people avoid theory because of that exact thing, because it isn't, two little highly emotionalized clips on Twitter, a few words that have certain emotional characteristics that, have this very not very in-depth and very superficial discussion. Let's see, Comrade Fox, what are your initial response to the piece?
Yeah. Well, my initial response to that is what is actually seeing this in a dialectical view of scientific socialism. He wasn't dogmatic about it. And I like how he put it at this little part. He said the whole truth about Leninism is that Leninism not only restored Marxism, but also took a step forward, developing Marxism further under the new conditions of capitalism and of the class struggle of the proletariat. So what it means is he's basically saying, things were in a constant state of change, and what Lenin did was adopt it to the current prevailing conditions of Russia at that time. And obviously this is what he's trying to say to the whole world: adopt scientific socialism under the current material conditions of your era or of your particular time. Not just don't just carbon copy what Marx just did. He actually brought it forward. He didn't, and one thing about it too, he argued it was like an argument against dogmatism. There's no blueprint. This is how it's supposed to be done. Oh no, what was said back then was absolutely gospel. He said, no, He not only revived it, but actually adopted it to the current prevailing conditions. And I think that's something we've always got to keep in mind. I've come across a lot of comrades out there over the years that are still quite dogmatic about a few things, not completely everything, but just a few things, and said, no, we're in this particular area now. So it's a good point that he raised through that. I'll just like to remind, and Caleb's watching this too. I like that little term. It's called A does not equal A, and I think that's and that really applies to this little reading here.
Christian. Christian, are you still with us? I got you unmuted. Looks like we lost our comrade Christian. He's probably on mobile data. That's a great initial response, David. I really like what you're saying there. Basically, he says, is Marxism the reemergence of the revolutionary elements after the moderate or non-revolutionary Second International? And he says, yes, but that's not all of it. And then he says, the truth is that Leninism recognized a new set of material conditions, the error of imperialism. So what he's saying is Marxism changes. A does not equal A. Things are constantly in motion. If conditions change in 24 hours, tactics should change in 24 hours. There is a material reality we are reacting to. Just if sometimes tactics will dictate that we push the people to fight with machine guns and arms against the state. Other times it will push for us to mobilize along material contradictions and form a mass coalition. I mean, there's different conditions, different tactics, and everything that was spoken may not be correct later. That's the very essence of scientific socialism. Comrade Fox?
That's right. And I think further he added to, he's obviously developed Lenin developed not only restored to Marxism, but developed it further out of the corrupted Second International. And you and I did a lot of talking on that when we were studying William Z. Foster's book, The History of the Three Internationals, which actually went into a lot more detail about the time of the Second International and how the rise of opportunism and that thought that, capitalism will just naturally develop into socialism, etc., and hence the rise of the social democratic parties, the whole lot. So that's I think it's something where Lenin came around and he actually pointed out. Lenin said, no, it doesn't work like that at all, and actually this is how it works, and this, well, not how it works, but how it develops further. So I mean, it really, just within those 2 pages, I mean, it covered a lot within a lot of history there within a particular short time. And I think it's something that, this is what I said, I love his work, how Stalin writes. It's so simplistic, but straight to the point. And actually, if you want to require further study, you can actually reference it further and have a look at yourself without having to be inundated with mountains and mountains of literature and books. So I think it's just something we've always got to keep in mind. But going back to what I was saying about matter and motion, that's what we've always got to keep. It's one thing fundamental we have to keep them in our minds. Everything's in a constant state of change. Nothing's static. Nothing's permanent. And A does not equal A. I know, we won't get into the whole discussions over looking at all the arguments, so various communist trends and people's Marxist different views and that around especially over the last 2 or 3 weeks. Particular things, and I just think, well, look, no, A does not equal A here. We're in the 3rd decade of the 21st century. Things are not. This is not the 1950s or the 1960s anymore. We've moved on. Our tactics need to change a whole lot.
Well, if anybody wants, I'm sorry we lost Christian. I gave him a message. I said, come back on if you can. If anybody wants we don't have a lot of material to go over tonight. So if people could ask questions or give us comments to further discussion, that would be greatly appreciated. I think I'll just give a few examples of how material conditions dictate both our understanding and our tactics. And I think a very good example is the revolutions in Latin America. Mao stood up, and I think a lot of people were inspired by Mao. When Mao was able to organize the oppressed peasants of China, stand out and kick out the imperialists, he inspired people all over the world, and also along with Stalin as well. So let's look into the 1950s and later even the 1970s with the Cuban Revolution and the Sandinista Nicaraguan Revolution. And these were revolutions fought against dictators. And they were guerrilla revolutions. They were, men, maybe even women out in the woods with guns coming up and violently organizing the people, living amongst the peasantry and working class, and taking power over the state through violent means. And it was very effective, and it happened, and it was very successful both in Cuba and later on in Nicaragua. Now let's fast forward a few decades, and let's look at was it 1999, the year Hugo Chavez came to power in Venezuela. Hugo Chavez did not come to power through a violent revolution. Hugo Chavez was elected into office, and he was elected in office through with a mass popular coalition. And there was some violent skirmishes, and there was a coup, and there has been several assassination attempts as well. And then I'm not sure which year. Let's move on to Evo Morales coming to power in Bolivia, who also came to power off a broad coalition of indigenous groups and labor groups and community groups. And they did it, through the election, but there was also, some clashes with the police with protesters and some defense of the revolution. And they actually had a coup for about a year or so before what was the difference? Why was violent revolution successful, earlier on, and then later, voting brought socialists into power? And the answer is the conditions. Under the situation of a dictator, the people did not have any ability to organize. They couldn't go out in the street. They couldn't talk to their neighbors. They couldn't, they couldn't organize organizations in the open. So they had no choice but to go underground and get the people who were tired of the system to form armed groups and fight against the system. But what's changed the conditions later on in the period of neoliberalism, where there's no longer a dictator in power, but you have the oppressive neoliberal system is actually intensifying the contradictions. But you're allowed to go out and organize. You're allowed to do some of this and some of that. So, and because people were able to organize and build power, and because that was fruitful, the people who insisted that they stay in the woods and, make these little guerrilla gangs, like I mentioned, the Shining Path in Peru, developed into terrorist groups. And, maybe they had some positive things here or there, but they weren't successful. They didn't take power because you can't continually use the same tactic in different conditions. And that's one example of that. David Fox, any response to that understanding? Maybe go ahead.
Well,
go ahead.
See, it was also too, I was only thinking about this the other day. What about Nepal? They're in Central Asia. It's a landlocked country, borders India and China and other countries there. But we also understand they had a massive civil war for a long time, led by more of a Maoist, not communist party. There was two communist parties, but in 2006 there was a revolution in a sense where it wasn't a violent revolution, but removed the the Royal Crown Prince, and then the merging of the two communist parties to form United Communist Party. And there's another party there as well. That's, well, I forget the name of it. It's a centrist party, but actually they both believe in socialism. Funny enough, one way or the other. And from there on, they've had a country that needs to be developed further. As well. So really there's no one way, one size fits all for any particular country. And I think it's something that's worthwhile to have a look what's going around the world, be it with Central and South America, but also with Asia as well. And as I said, there was Nepal, what's going on elsewhere. And I think it's important. There's just no one method of doing things. I mean, I could understand that with the communists, say, of the 1920s and 30s. They used the Soviet model, and obviously by the Communist International, the Comintern, it was what once known as. I got that, because really, in the sense where they had nothing else to show. So really, this was it. That was the way forward. And this is where we have to be a little bit careful, not to be dogmatic and fall into that trap. We need to apply it. And actually, you mentioned Comrade Mao before. He actually went against the Comintern. He says, no, it's the peasants in China that are going to be the revolutionary force instead of the proletariat. It's something to always take into account. And he took it one step further, and he applied the scientific socialism and the prevailing conditions of then China. It's like what we would have to do now. We could learn from it. So much rich history there we can learn from. So yeah, there is no one way forward. It could be many things. I mean, highly industrial countries, they could do it through strike action or something like. I'm not saying it will happen that way, but they could do it like that way. Where others, where underdeveloped countries, or those countries have been basically poor, well, might be through the peasantry or the rural poor, or whoever at the time. It could be the revolutionary force. So there's no one way of just going about things, and I think that's vitally important to understand how these readings. Look, basically the message is fit it to the prevailing conditions of your country. I mean, Comrade E. Tatist said something there: the serious application of Marxism's to concrete national and historical conditions, not simply an application, but more a further development of Marxism. And you're absolutely correct. That's why we develop it further here.
I just wanted to clarify my statement about the Shining Path in Peru. There was horrible government repression of them that was completely unjustified. They committed crimes themselves, but the absolute horrific suppression of them was completely unjustified. And I think when we get into it, and why the material conditions are so important, is because the people are the source of all revolutionary peoples, of all revolutionaries' power. It is your ability to organize the masses, and the masses are going to fight for their interests. So if the masses don't see success from hiding out in the woods and fighting against the government that's there, and they do it for years and years and years and sacrifice, and they don't get anywhere, they're not going to want to continue that tactic, and they're going to try other tactics. And that is why they came up with, power building, coalition building, and eventually took state power through the ballot box in an oppressed nation within their situation. I kind of want, there's a question here by Ryan. I'm going to go over. I want to talk a little bit about the Second International and how this appeals to material conditions as well. Marx and the First International. I feel like we're going back over. If anybody wants to go back, the very start of Working Class Revolt was I think it was a six-part series, almost 12 hours of video, where we discuss the great American communist William Z. Foster, who goes down, in basic language, explains the importance of the First, the Second, and the Third International. And I just want to talk a little bit about, the First International was in Marx's time, and it really was the beginnings of capitalism. It was the beginnings of the anti-feudal revolutions, the emergence of capitalism. And the conditions were horrible and bleak, and the workers were ready, to fight against it. and we have the Paris Commune as the very first start of that. But then socialism became this huge thing. There was socialism everywhere, but it was because the bourgeoisie was so weak and capitalism was still in formation. Organizing these unions with these socialist parties were able to get such a material gain very quickly that people started not to see the need for a socialist revolution. So the capitalists were able to stay in power, and then the the labor bureaucrats and the Socialist Party leaders started to cooperate and become part of the ruling class. And then it wasn't until Stalin and Lenin with his party of the new type, with the specific conditions in Russia, which had the worst of the conditions of Europe and from the oppressed world, because it was really on the outside of imperialism, but was still being used for imperialism. That will be in the first section we'll go over. It's from that Lenin was able to organize that and stop, having these mass socialist parties that were, moderate and in with the bourgeois government, but form this secret, almost secret vanguard society with democratic centralism, and use the demands of peace, land, and bread to mobilize the people, kick out the czar, and eventually create the first large-scale socialist revolution. Go ahead, Comrade Fox.
But that period of the Second International and in the rise of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and not just them, but what was going on in what was then Tsarist Russia. They're obviously there was a very backward country, very underdeveloped. Poverty was quite extreme. Sure, we had extreme poverty here in our respective countries as well. For example, in the Australian experience, a lot of the unions, after the strike waves of the 1890s, realised they had to have a form of parliamentary representation. So they formed the Australian Labor Party, which actually formulated after 1901. They believe there was laws and acts put in place about, from various industrial awards, union recognition and that. So constantly it was a way to actually bring the unions in as part of the system. And understand the development of unions too, actually came about because of capitalism. They're products of capitalism. And obviously workers combined together, or sections of workers combined together to collectivise their interests and to move forward, to fight for their better interests. And I think we've got to keep an understanding on it. And I think Engels actually hit the nail on the head about some unions at times, where they were saying, well, no, in our respective countries, they're not revolutionary as such. Sure, they will strike, they will fight the bourgeoisie to get better gains, which they do, and that should be supported as well. But they're not there to threaten bourgeois rule. That's the difference. To challenge bourgeois rule, how dare you rule us with profits, and we want to change society. So it's something that I always keep in the back of their mind. Are unions bad? No, that's not. Wasn't that part at all. But that's where they naturally transition to. Where Lenin, on the other hand, says no, we're here to actually not just challenge bourgeois rule, but to get rid of it once and all and bring in proletarian rule instead.
Very powerful, very powerful. I think to add to earlier, it was really the changing conditions, because imperialism hadn't developed, to make basically it was a labor aristocracy that, because the Second International was in imperialist countries, and the capitalist imperialists were able to push down a portion of the stolen goods from the oppressed nations. They were able to buy them off, at least the leadership, and then it was imperialism, because because Russia wasn't enjoying, or the Russian capitalist class didn't have as much to kick down to the workers. That is why they were able to do it. And this really signifies This signifies how Marx's ideas that the revolutionary energy would come from the imperialist world was wrong. I mean, Marx couldn't have seen that because that was a further development, you know. And Lenin
Yes,
looked
right.
at the conditions, used Marx, applied the science, and saw that the revolutionary energy was coming from the oppressed nations. Let's go on to this question. A very good friend of the show, also an active member in the Working Class Revolt Facebook chat group. If you would like to be a part of the Working Class Revolt Facebook chat group, please send me a message on Facebook or send me an email at workingclassrevolt@gmail.com. We're going to start and read this and hopefully answer it. Is it possible that giving our material conditions in the U.S., the fact that so many are reactionary, maybe a different style is needed instead of getting the masses the way China or Russia did? That's a good question. That's a very good question. So China was an oppressed country, and China went through a century of humiliation. And the peasants, they had feudal beliefs. They were binding women's feet, specifically in the upper classes. Their material conditions were horrible, and they were picked on and degraded. We talk about this in the Hunan province, the report from the Hunan province. We talked about that in our study, and that's the several ways the people were put in horrible conditions and were pressured to rise up and fight when organized along the correct material conditions, as Mao did. Now, how does that compare to the United States in the current era? I would say, like the Second International, we just went through a time period of a labor aristocracy. In the 1930s, the United States, with all of its racism, with all of its colonial genocide, it had a mass communist party. And the mass communist party was able to convince KKK carrying members to burn their KKK card and join the Communist Party. I mean, that is what the ability of organizing along the material, people's material needs has the ability to do. Not the liberal appeals to justify the imperial system, but to go to the working class, regardless of their development on social issues and other issues, appeal to their economic conditions, and it will move mountains when in regard to social development. And we saw that. We saw a glimpse of that in the 1930s and 40s. Now, I believe it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was in coalition with the communists to make gangs that really fomented and made and saved capitalism, along with the mass communist party, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and competition with the Soviet Union, were able to improve the lives of the workers and actually create a labor aristocracy. And this labor aristocracy, because of the roots of, the oppression of Afro-American people and the oppression of Chicano brothers and sisters and indigenous people, oppressed people from oppressed nations that I mentioned were largely left out of this labor aristocracy. Some were part of it. But let's look at the conditions now. Ever since the advent of neoliberalism, we're talking about the 70s and 80s, starting with Jimmy Carter, moving on into Reagan. After the Soviet Union starts to lose power, and the Soviet Union is being pressured to work against its own interests and fight against the Chinese. The CIA in the United States and forces in the United States are having China and the Soviet Union fight with each other to weaken their camp. And because of this, the United States imperialism was able to expand. and then use those resources to continue to buy off a section of U.S. workers. And now, with the rise of China, and with these intensifying neoliberal policies, the Soviet Union fell, but even before that, when it was in decline, they really weren't worried about it. Before, the Soviet Union was printing pictures of Emmett Till and saying, and Paul Robeson was going to the Soviet Union and saying, "I feel like a man for the first time with no color prejudice." And you got to think about, and communist organizers, spearheaded the civil rights movement and pushed the civil rights movement. So the United States, in response, co-opted the civil rights and pushed forces that were more beneficial to them. And they had to make a change. They couldn't be the brutal, segregationist state. They had to change it and make this neoliberal era where they gave the appearance as if they were progressing and if they were liberal, they're positive, but they continued the harsh economic exploitation of the people. And and we look at this with these, with the destruction of social democracy, the conditions have been horrible. They've moved our jobs overseas. They have, taken away our limited public resources. They introduced crack cocaine first into the Black community, and now they've introduced opioids into the more rural communities and communities in general. And the conditions are completely same. The labor aristocracy is crumbling. So I think we still need to get to the masses. We definitely still need to get the masses. And with all the reactionary social views of the people that are left over from the, McCarthyism and from the racism that's been able to maintain the capitalist system, as the capitalist system crumbles, people are going to question the capitalist system. People will question the imperialist system. And people can start rejecting racism and start accepting and embracing international solidarity and an organization that will improve the material conditions of the people. We need mass organizations that are organized along class and national lines to fight for material conditions and eventually take power and form socialism. I know I gave a long-winded answer and I went a lot of places, but David Fox, if you got any response to that, go ahead.
Well, I think for us in Australia, and I know someone made a comment before about the Latin American, so the models they have in Central and South America. Yes, we should study that, I think, for trying to apply, maybe learn some good, valuable lessons, how we could apply it for change here in Australia. Keep in mind, look, Australia, look at our long history. When it came out of the 1900s, during that era of the Second International, capitalism was still developing. So it was still in its infancy. Even Lenin wrote about for example, just take a little step, when the trade unions formed the Australian Labor Party, Lenin said on Australia in 1913 that the Labor Party is a liberal bourgeois party. We're the most capital servings of the labour movement, most capital serving elements of the labour movement, and the liberals, as especially in our modern age, are actually conservatives. So until the workers in this country realise that their conditions need changing, they will come up with a revolutionary party. But I think looking at it, Australia overall, in the whole scheme of things, especially in the whole Anglosphere, but the whole world, has been a relatively stable capitalist society, especially after World War II. Yes, there was some revolt back in the 1920s and 30s, but the Great Depression, we had the Wobblies during World War I. Yeah, and we've got some rich history there as well, and also the struggle on the Central Goldfields, etc. But and also the Indigenous struggle as well. But keep in mind too, we were actually we were drawn in with this White Australia policy, which was no doubt supported by the Labor Party. And for the years, Indigenous people, or First Nations people, we should correctly put them, weren't even recognised as citizens until 1967, and they were discriminated, and still are to this day, weren't given the opportunities like everyone else was. And even a lot of the European workers that came over after World War II, a lot of them faced a lot of heavy discrimination. And it actually took a lot of unions, especially communist-led unions mainly, to actually organise around that, and the Communist Party, but through the communist-led unions, to break through that and bring some unity amongst the working class to achieve some social gains. I mean, that 1967 referendum to recognise the First Nations people as citizens, that was actually because of the struggles led by the Communist Party, the working class, and a lot of consistent education, etc. It wasn't just because someone came along, oh, we better do that. It didn't happen that at all. And the fact that it's been still some ongoing, and still a lot of ongoing struggles to this day. So we've always got to keep in mind to look at where Australia's role, and for ourselves here, to get understand the history. And I mean, as another comrade actually correctly pointed out, we need to know our own history. It's great to know the history about every other country, but we need to know our very own history and its rich traditions, but also its dark side as well, and understand that. And a lot of stuff that I learned in school wasn't taught to us, but now it's coming out of the woodwork as well. So, and we need to actually make sure education is the big important key factor in there. But it has to be relative to people's current economic struggles to this day. And I think that's something we've got to break through. And I think that's where to target it. I had a discussion once with someone, someone brought up the issue about refugees, and of course he was quite reactionary in his outlook, and he's going, oh no, that's a fundamental, he thinks it was the key thing to stop the refugees coming in this country. And I said, I'll pull up there, and I started to tackle him at a different angle, instead of actually accusing him of this and being nasty and everything else. But I said, well, while we're at it, I said, while we're in this discussion, what about the economic conditions? We're seeing everything being sold off, economic situation of the workers deteriorating. And this wasn't so long, it was about over 10 years ago. So, and even back then it was. And when I was explaining where housing's out of reach, we're trying to run around for the next good paying job, and they're becoming fewer and fewer. Don't you think that's more fundamental than people trying to seek refuge in this country? And he actually thought on that for a sec and actually goes, well, you're right. We're being distracted by something else. And even though I probably disagree with him there, but at least I try to get him focused on something and start questioning the system. And same with another situation where a worker, I believe he was made redundant, but someone else at the same time at the same plant was doing his job. Now, was that an unfair dismissal, etc.? Well, long story short, we took it to the what we call the Fair Work Commission. We call it here in Australia, ran it, and even though the commission ruled in favour of the company, it was a genuine redundancy. They didn't need as many workers there. But he actually came to his own conclusion and said, this system isn't for us, is it? And I go, no. I'm glad that he didn't. So some people's personal experiences, when you start honing on that, or start targeting that, you can actually start get them to start questioning the system as well. It's going to take a long road to do it. It's not going to be one person doing everything, but I think we've got to learn the lessons from many other comrades from around the world and struggles and solutions, but two, how are we going to apply it here and how are we going to work collectively moving forward to bring everyone up to a revolutionary consciousness, because that's what's desperately needed. I mean, I'll say in most countries here, especially in the Anglosphere at the moment.
We have quite a bit of discussion in the back and forth and discussion in the comments, and I think everybody.
Hi, Keaton.
Shout out to Keaton, and shout out to the Flame of Liberation, which gave this very interesting historical note. The Soviet Union and I believe DPRK gave the proven government military support 1980s against the Shining Path, and I'm not even going to get into the contradictions. I mean, history is like this. This is something that our comrade Carlos Gavin is into, these little historical things, that kind of go into each other. But that's interesting. Flame of Liberation. And if you'd like to know more from a very knowledgeable source, I highly like everyone go out and like the Flame of Liberation on both Facebook and Twitter. We had this question from Luke Buckmaster, I believe, an Australian comrade. Do you think the Latin American populist model for socialism is a better strategy for the Anglosphere, and I believe he's talking about England, Australia, New Zealand, the United States. Um, that's an interesting term, but essentially, um, yes, we discussed learning. If you go back and watch our video with Carlos Lagunas Driscoll and Karenaki Paez, we discuss that question in depth, and the answer is yes. There is much we can learn about, the mass movement, the Venezuelan revolution, the Chavistas, and also even social democrat mobilizations like AMLO in Mexico. We can definitely learn from, and I think that's what is needed in the United States. First of all, we need, I think Social Theory talked about 3 steps in a revolution. First comes the economic revolution, where it changes the economic conditions. Then that creates a reaction to that, a social revolution, eventually a political revolution. And in our current time, we've already had the economic revolution through the computer revolution. And that was able to really bring in the neoliberal policies that have destroyed the labor aristocracy and made conditions worse and created the police state that we have. Furthering on the police state we have with policies like the crime bill that the current president signed and put a lot of people in prison, and so on and so forth. But I think right now we're in that social revolution. And in the United States, it was the first Great Awakening, which was a religious movement. But religious movements are just expressions of the people's, sentiments that help lead to the American Revolution. And then the second Great Awakening, which is also a religious movement, which one of my ancestors was involved in, Ashel Nettleton, was really, who was a preacher who converted 30,000 people, over 30,000 people to Christianity. I think I'm carrying on his legacy by preaching the good word of scientific socialism. And what is now, I believe, and the second Great Awakening was really the social force behind the abolitionist movement and John Brown that led to the Civil War, which many communists and socialists refer to as the Second American Revolution. The masses of abolitionists and workers and free slaves to violently put down the oppressive, regressive slave regime of the South. And I think right now we're in the era of a social revolution, and it really will be a third Great Awakening. And there will be a moral, intellectual, and spiritual, even I said that, I know I'm a communist, but a spiritual awakening of the people when they cannot stand to see the treatment, the continued treatment as their conditions working, the continued harsh treatment of our black and brown brothers and sisters. And we're being forced down in the proletariat, and they won't be able to stand, people going hungry, and they won't be able to stand what this country is doing all over the world. And I think there will be a radical social transformation that will, and a lot of that has to do with ideology and spreading ideology. And we're in that time of spreading ideology to the people. And when we have that ideological base, and we have that cultural understanding, and that people come to, I think we can build the mass movements and mass mobilizations that will eventually form the political revolution. I know I said a lot, and that's kind of my line, but go ahead, Comrade Fox.
Yeah. Look, we do have a rich history, and Luke just pointed something out before. We learned school. I learned a few things in school where they probably didn't teach us back in the 2000s. I'm not too sure, but I remember once when I had an apprentice working with me, and he asked me Eureka flag was. I had it on my toolbox, and I explained to him, did they ever teach you that in school? And he goes, no. So, which gobsmacked me, because I learned about that when I was in primary school. So that was, it shows you how too our ruling classes through the respective governments will try and change history and falsify it, and want you to learn a particular style and don't want you to know anything else. And I think for us in Australia, they don't know about our struggles. I mean, first of all, you had the anti-colonial struggles of the First Nations, and I mean that's vitally important, still continuing this day. And their struggle for land rights against black deaths in custody, recognition, just to basically survive day to day, and also struggle for a treaty as well, and for their own determination. You also had the struggle against the brutal authorities by the early convicts as well, and it was a brutal penal system, and there was a struggle against that. And also too, remember, we had the Goldfields rebellions against not just about a tax, but actually being taxed without being represented as well. There was no democratic rights. It actually challenged the rule of the landlord or the squattocracy, and also the brilliant top military brass and all the exclusive rich. They all had a say about how things should run. They didn't want to see you improve your situation, so they tax everyone, and not only just those who dug gold, but anyone. You could be a blacksmith, you could be a market gardener, you still had to pay a gold tax without any representation. So, some sort of suffrage through that. We also had the union struggles, which still continues to this day as well. Vitally important is still backed by. And there were a lot of rich history there. The union struggles weren't just about wages and conditions, but a lot of social issues as well. So, and green bands, or the environment movement as well, such as the green bands of the early 70s. That's a part of it, but also marching against imperialist war. Unions supported Indonesian independence. So, the waterfront unions refused to load Dutch ships. And that was a big factor in helping Indonesia, but also during the Vietnam War period, a lot of left-wing unions were at the forefront of the moratorium against the Vietnam War, and actually the waterfront unions once again refused to load ships or whatever for those to point in Vietnam. As simple as that. So we do have some very big struggles here. We had the industrial workers of the world, which was huge here at one stage, both in central Queensland and western New South Wales. They played a vital role, and also against the anti-conscription, and also for the anti-conscription struggles of the World War One. The first Anzac Day, interesting enough, was a sign of rebellion on the Western Front there, where workers, where the soldiers themselves were volunteers, and that they come to realise that we were dying as cannon fighter for the British Empire, for British imperialist interests. So they actually had a silent protest, a form of rebellion to remember those who'd fallen gunfight. From then on, you had war memorials all around Australia and New Zealand, actually, with all the list of the names of the fallen. To let the bourgeoisie know, the ruling class know, this is your fault, this is what you did, just a reminder of what you did. And a lot of them came back from that war, anti-war, and a lot of them pro-communist and socialist as well. And the formation of the Communist Party of Australia, etc. And I mean, there's millions more, but we do have a rich history of struggle here. And I think that's something we need to learn ourselves is, okay, what went right, what didn't go right, so right, we learn from that, how we can tap back into that spirit and revive that spirit again to further social change. And we do need more, not just parliamentary changes and a few conditions change. We need to actually understand, do more than just change a government. We need to change the system. As simple as that. Because the way we're carrying on at the moment, Australia is going down the gurgler, and we should we should come to realise, no, we need to change the system once and for all. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, we're going on over an hour. We've completely lost from the original subject, which was foundations of Leninism. We got a quick question here from Flame of Liberation. I guess we'll do this one more question and then do our concluding remarks. And this one's directed at David Fox as well. Flame of Liberation, I would be curious to learn more about U.S. interference in Australia's politics. Americans are very unaware of the relationship between Australia and the United States.
Okay, well, going back, we should actually go back a lot further, back into the height of World War II. Now, traditionally, right up to then, Australia was still regarded as part of the British Empire, interesting enough, where when World War II did break out, Britain declared war on Germany, so did Australia straight away. And obviously, we're up to by British interests again. After after the fall of Singapore, Australia, and there was also a change of government. There was a vote of no confidence in the Menzies government, and there was independent that walked across the floor and sided with the Labor Party, and the Labor Party formed government under John Curtin. And John Curtin saw what Australia's dire situation was at the time. His government, we were ready to be overrun by Imperial Japan. And so basically there was massive arguments with the United Kingdom, the British government with Churchill said, no, we need to prioritise Australia, sorry. And we had to start defending ourselves because all the islands leading down to where their northern shoreline, northern coast was being overrun by Japan. And it was a pinnacle fight there in Papua New Guinea, obviously on the Kokoda Trail. Now, as I said, if Japan was to get its way, and we obviously would have been completely overrun, no doubt about it. And actually, the previous governor, John Curtin, under Robert Menzies, knows the United Australia policy, yes, he formed government again after 1950. The reality was he was actually prepared to sell Australia out to Japanese interests as well and form what we called the Brisbane Line, which was be formed north of the where the Maroochy River is. For those of you in Australia, stand all down the east coast down through to Adelaide and partly inland. The rest would have been handed over to Imperial Japan. And we would have had a Vichy little style, fascist little style government running Australia. So you had people collaborating with Imperial Japan, but John Curtin was awake up to it, or his government was, and he said no. Now, what came to pinnacle point was when we were actually close on being invaded, and what John Curtin did is looked at had discussions with the United States, and obviously Pearl Harbor kicked that around and brought the US into the war as well. And obviously that was when the alliance said had been under with the UK. We switched our alliance with the US instead and began to form the allies of the Pacific. And from there on, it turned things around for us. And I think and New Zealand was part of that as well. So that relations went on. Now, John Curtin did want to actually have Australia develop its own foreign policy, its own independent path. Obviously, from then on, a lot of things, when you sign an alliance like that, there was a lot of conditions put in place and says, no, you're not. If you do that, we'll completely screw you in the end. And consequently, further government administrations further ratify the US-Australia alliance, especially during the Cold War era, and we obviously followed suit going into fighting in Korea, Malaya, which now known as Malaysia, but also Vietnam, and where our policy was tied up with US foreign policy. We're a very Anglophile country, so we just went without question. But Vietnam certainly was the pinnacle to question it all. Now, the government, after 23 years of conservative rule from 1949 through to 1972, the Social Democratic Party of the Labor Party was brought in under Gough Whitlam, sweeping reforms. And one of the first things he did was withdrew Australia out of Vietnam. He obviously had a few firm words with the American administration at the time, especially with the bombing of Hanoi and a few other things, and they did not like it. He also found out too that Australia set up a secret spy base in Chile at the time and had that closed down as well. So a lot of things he had the policy. He was an economic could say nationalist in the sense where he wanted to buy back the farm, in the sense that for us communist socialist Marxists, we would prefer to nationalise it without any compensation. But anyway, that's another discussion another time. But he actually started to go against US foreign policy and also British foreign policy, British capital, US capital, and that was a big no-no. In the end, there was a lot of shady meetings behind the scenes with the Crown itself, represented through the Governor General, Sir John Kerr, at the time. And basically, John Kerr was actually what we call a soft coup, Kerr's Kerr, sacked the Whitlam government with the blessing of the CIA and the British establishment as well. From there on,
you just say Australia you said Australia. I think a lot of people don't know this detail. Australia had a soft coup.
Yeah.
Now, Australia is an imperialist country, or a junior partner.
But we're tied up with US foreign
to the imperialist system,
and
the CIA performed a soft coup against one of their allies. Not an oppressed nation, but a soft coup against one of their imperialist allies. That is the strength and destructiveness of the imperial system, not only against
Yeah.
the oppressed nations,
It's-
but against the people and the democratic rights of the people within the imperial's countries. I just go ahead. That's an important note. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
and that's what exactly. Yeah, and that's what is important to understand where Australia's role in this, and everything down to the current days. Now, from there on, successive governments never challenged it. Interesting, the leader of the trade union movement at the time, the one Bob Hawke, who became later Prime Minister, was a CIA stooge or paid operative here in Australia, because he could have it could have been called a national strike. We could have brought the system down and we would really re-established the Whitlam government again, but it didn't happen. It was like maintain the rage and wait till we get to the ballot box. Consequently, when the elections did happen to come around next time, he was actually lost. And it was deliberately done in such a way by all these forces, very shady characters, etc., behind to bring down any type of form of Australian independence or our own independent path. Now, leading up to the modern period, another one just happened not so long in the late 2000s when Kevin Rudd was our Prime Minister. Now, the fact is, the reason why he was deposed, and that there was an internal one when the Labor government was in, and Julia Gillard came to the pro, is because Kevin Rudd was getting a little bit too uncomfortably close to China for US interests. They said you've got to have volunteer security or stability, one or the other. He came a little bit too close. A phone call came in from the US consulate to then Paul Howes, who was the leader of the Australian Workers Union, and to a couple of key Labor figures. And they said, get rid of him or else. And they said, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, sir, 3 bags full, sir. And off they did. And consequently, he lost his job. First thing that Julia Gillard did was got onto the phone when she became Prime Minister, was on the phone to Barack Obama at the time. And they'd never seen anything so crazy. She'd worshipped Barack and also reported to the US consulate. And then as soon as she possibly could, was off on a plane to Washington, to receive her orders. Now, just recently, you've actually seen what happens with this ANZUC, which is Australia, also, how you pronounce it? OSAC, whatever it is, Australia, US, UK, this thing with the nuclear submarines. Now, we had a contract with France to build 12 new submarines. They weren't going to be nuclear powered, but now all of a sudden, earlier this year, obviously Morrison was over in England there, Cornwall, with this big summit. Obviously, there was some dealings there, and the idea was it was all came out of the Five Eyes and all these other things. How we're going to address China, and that's what it comes down to at the end of the day. Our trade relations, we had strong trade relations with China, which is very weakening. But all of a sudden, we're trying to increase this US. It was really big. It's interesting. We're trying to protect our trade with China at the same time trying to attack China. I don't know what. Yeah, it sounds absurd, but this is what actually in fact it's doing. And we used as basically an aircraft carrier launching point to pivot into China. Certainly, I mean, a lot of people have got to understand when they start reading for it. I actually do recommend reading John Pilger's book, like Secret Country and Hidden Agendas. And he actually did one of the upcoming war against Russia and China. He does disagree with us about the Soviet Union, etc. But he did write some very good material there. And I think and when you start researching, there's a lot more material out there about Australia's role. But when people actually really knew what was going on, there'd be a completely different change of direction here in Australia. And I think we've got to understand that. Yeah, the US government, or what the powers that be over there, regardless if you're an ally or you're not an ally, you're only dictates. You do as what we say. And I like how the words of Henry Kissinger came out one time. And one thing probably where all of us could agree, to be an enemy of the US is dangerous, but to be an ally is outright deadly. And I think we've got to keep that in American minds. A lot of American folk didn't know this, and don't know this, and I'm not expecting them to know this. But I think it's vitally important for us here in Australia, but all for all sides around the Pacific here, to understand what's really going on. And I think Australia is. I wouldn't classify them as an imperial power in their own right, but we are a junior partner in the whole imperial bloc. That's probably what I put it, although a lot of people, comrades, will disagree with me, and that's fine. It's an ongoing discussion. But hopefully I've covered a lot there in a short period of time.
Very informative and very, very important. Maybe I'll do a response. We're going to go. Sorry, we're not going to get to all of the questions. we're running a little bit late. We're going to get into our closing remarks. I got a text from Christian, and his computer died. We thank him for joining us. If he finishes watching, hopefully we'll be able to have Christian, the socially radical guitarist. You can, I think I'll share out or put in the description his YouTube channel so people can subscribe to his YouTube channel and watch his radio show. Just to respond to that very, straightforward, down to earth, quick explanation of Australian history. That was very wonderful. I'm glad we were able to include that in the show. I think I'm often reminded by our great friend, the professor who leads studies in Cuba, the great Dr. Jose Prado, who we have archived on this channel. We have archived his study with the great revolutionary Chicano poet Matt Cedillo. We have archived almost what's 80. There's like 40 episodes. They're an hour apiece. There's over 40 hours, a full work week worth of them studying Marxist capital from the Chicano perspective. Very beautiful. But I think during one of those episodes, he says, we got friends on this show that rightly bastardized the English language. And he was talking about myself and you. And I'm from the South, which has been a more, a more exploited region because of, the legacy of slavery and other things. And I'd say that we have a very similar condition with Australia, as a junior partner. And it's kind of interesting. We kind of, linked two working class guys kind of linked up on that. And I think Australia is going to have an interesting, being so close to China and trading so much with China, and China becoming the world socialist superpower, promoting win-win trade. It's going to be more and more, even within the bourgeois interest of Australia, to want to shift and do more trading and reject the mandates of U.S. imperialism. And I think that's interesting and could play out. I mean, you guys could, there's a lot of revolutionary potential there to shift into that. What if Australia was to have a socialist revolution, or not even have a socialist revolution? What if Australia, even if it remained capitalist, was able to transfer over into the political and economic anti-imperialist bloc? That's very interesting. So, if I could end things, we're going to continue studying the foundations of Leninism. Next week, we're going to have a work meeting, and we're going to have the comrade Victor Coronado from Anticonquista is going to come on and discuss. We're going to interview him and have news and labor updates. That's going to be good. Mark your calendars for the 25th. And then we're also going to be continuing to study the foundations of Leninism with the great man Stalin himself. Comrade Fox, any closing remarks?
Well, there's been a great discussion. I think there's a lot out of reading those 2 pages. There was a lot. They covered a lot of ground, and I think it was good to actually talk about that. And thank you for giving me the pleasure to actually talk about Australia's role in current world affairs and some history there as well. I would highly recommend, if you can get copies of this, of the problems of Leninism, or Stalin's problems of Leninism. It certainly, you can actually order it. I think you can buy it online. I think some of the respective communist parties might have copies of it as well. I agree, Luke. It can be a mongrel language to begin with, if you want. if you want, and I do apologise to those whose English is not their mother language, in the sense where, look, we've got our slang, our different accents, so I do apologise. We try. We do not speak like the Queen here in Australia either. Some people do, actually. I've come across a few. However, we'll just keep that in the back of our mind as well. But it's been a great show today. Shame what happened to Christian's phone. I'm going to have a look at his YouTube channel later on and listen to some of his guitar music. The other thing as well, too, comrades, on Thursday evening at 7 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time, we're still continuing our study, myself and Helen. I think Nate's just joined us. Hope you'll be there too, and anyone else wishing to join on. We're continuing to study the document Peru Libre. Obviously, there's a lot to discuss in there. We had a great discussion the other day, and fantastic discussion about democracy. This actually stemmed from our study of We Are the City Builders study manual by Caleb Morton. So feel free, just send us a message if you wish to join in. I can send you the link later on.
All right, if we raise your
Have
fist,
you.
comrade. Okay.
Yeah.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to win.
Dare to win.
All power to the people.
All power to the people.
All right, have a good one. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.